Hey, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
All is well, all is well. First and foremost, thank you so much for coming on the platform. I really appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thanks for reaching out.
All right, all right. For the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are and definitely where you're from?
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Arielle Baskin-Sommers. I am a faculty member at Yale University in the departments of psychology and psychiatry, and I also have an appointment at Yale Law School.
Wow, okay, that's real cool. That's real cool. Now, I wanted to ask you this. When did you develop this passion for psychology? Was this something you kind of got into early on, or did you get into it later in life?
Yeah, I took a class in high school on psychology and knew I was always interested in human behavior broadly. I grew up with two parents who are sociologists who would always take me traveling, and they would always point out similarities and differences across cultures. So I just had a fascination for human behavior. So when I took a class in high school, I was like, oh, I kind of like this. And then when I was in college, took a bunch of psychology and neuroscience classes and really liked the blend of doing kind of the harder science, looking under the skin, but also connecting that to the real life human behavior that we can see with our own eyes. And so then that kind of developed over time.
Wow, okay, okay. That's good you had that influence early on. Now, what's the difference between like say psychology and sociology?
Yeah, so sociology tends to be more observational, although there are some sociologists who use, more objective data as well. But it really tries to understand kind of the ecosystems or the environment more broadly and how the individual might, navigate that environment. Whereas psychology is more focused on looking more mechanistically at emotional or thinking patterns, or in my case, really looking at kind of how the brain and behavior and environment all intersect.
Okay, okay. Thank you for breaking that down. I wanted to ask you about one of your papers you had online, and it was kind of going into I guess the dysfunction when responding to facial effects. I guess individuals that were incarcerated. If you could talk about what kind of inspired you to even pursue that, and what was that process like?
Yeah. So a lot of my work is trying to understand how different thinking and emotional patterns might contribute to risky and impulsive behaviors. And what we end up studying are often people who come into contact with the legal system as a really serious consequence of risky and impulsive behavior. And there are a lot of assumptions that are made about why people might commit crimes or why people might get in trouble with the law. And what we found over time is that for people who are repeatedly getting into trouble with the law, who might have some kind of underlying differences in how they're perceiving the world, that some of the most kind of fundamental psychological functions that all of us have, like noticing facial affect or facial emotions or how we relate to one another's, might be a little different in certain people. And so the main motivation in our work is to try to just document how that might be different. So to document, for people who are coming from certain neighborhoods or who have certain personality characteristics, can we assume that they are seeing the world in the same way as people who are not coming from those neighborhoods or who don't have those personality characteristics? And what we find time and time again is that there are certain environments and certain personality characteristics that are related to differences in basic psychological functions, and that those differences contribute to these very consequential behaviors that lead people to end up being incarcerated.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Now, was there a certain level of consistency? Like, what were some of the factors? Is it genetics? Is it maybe they went through something as a child or adulthood? Or
Yeah, all of the above of what you just said. I think one of the really interesting things about repeated risky behavior or repeated criminal behavior is that there are lots of subtypes. So there's not going to be just kind of one explanation that works for everyone. And so what we know is that there's one subtype where there's some genetic influence, but it's a lot of environmental influence. And so environmental factors like being exposed to community violence, so hearing gunshots in your neighborhood, seeing people get stabbed or beat up, and living in a neighborhood with a lot of disadvantage. So lack of access to resources, lack of after school programs. These are two factors that are related to a greater likelihood of engaging in risky and impulsive behavior. But then there's another subtype that we know where it's actually largely genetic. So it doesn't mean environment doesn't play a role at all, but it just means that the kind of starting place, someone's starting with much more genetic risk. And that then the factors that are at play have to do with buffering against that genetic risk rather than just changing a certain environmental characteristic.
Okay. Now I can ask you now, how much time does it take to do research on something like this? Is this a few months, a semester, a few years, or?
Yes, it's something my grad students and I joke about quite a bit because, what we ultimately are is a lab that really tries to understand these complex behaviors. And so it takes a lot of time. So one single study to get enough people that represent the variety of experiences we're interested in, to make sure we're surveying enough people. The shortest amount of time is usually about a year to 18 months to complete a study, and that's before writing it up. So that's just the data collection portion. So my grad students often feel a little jealous of some of the other types of research where they could just, put a survey online and get 1,000 participants in a day. That's not the type of work that we're doing. And again, some of it is the behaviors are really complicated. It's hard to reach population, but we're also assessing a lot of different things all at once. So we try to get a thorough evaluation of someone's environment. We have them do computer testing and sometimes brain imaging. We also try to get information about their family and friends. And so each single visit is at least 4 hours, if not 8 hours long. And so, multiply that by 200 people, it's going to take a really long time to get a full sample.
Wow. Okay. Now, when you say visits, are you talking about the actual prisoners? Do you actually get to talk to people that are incarcerated or work incarcerated at one time?
Yeah, so we're very lucky. I have two different labs. One is in the community in New Haven, Connecticut, where we pull from the larger community and recruit people who just self-report engaging in risky and impulsive behavior. And so what ends up happening is that we do get a lot of people who have had contact with the legal system. So for example, of our current sample, about 70% have been arrested before and just about 50% have been incarcerated before. And this is really important because I think a lot of community research often excludes people who have the type of experiences that we're bringing in because they might exclude for certain medications, certain background factors. And so our lab in the community is one that is pretty uncommon in terms of the variety of experiences that we bring in. We also do have a second lab that is built inside a prison in Connecticut. And in those, we bring people directly from their units to complete interviews and games within the prison. And this is very rare. So only a handful of researchers throughout the United States have a lab inside a prison. And again, it really kind of helps us be able to get a more complete picture of the experiences that people have and get a sense of all the things they've been through and what they're going through while they're currently incarcerated.
Yeah, definitely. I take my hat off to you. You're doing some major work. You had spoke about the community a little bit. Now, by you doing this type of work, have you received any pushback or any difficulties throughout this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think a common question that rightfully comes up is, what good will our work do, or are we just exploiting communities that maybe don't have as much power? And one of the things we really try to do is make sure in all of our work we're representing the voices of the people that we're trying to understand from a psychological perspective. So we do this in a few ways. One is that we often hold focus groups to listen to potential participants about things that they're concerned about in their communities or their experiences, and to get some feedback on the types of measures we're given. Are there things that we're asking or doing that feel problematic in certain ways? The other way we make sure that we're not just doing research for the sake of research, but ensuring that the findings our lab generates, as well as other labs throughout the United States, actually have an impact, is by trying to make sure that the kind of cutting edge research is being disseminated to policymakers and lawyers. So I often give talks to judges and lawyers throughout the country to give them a more up-to-date knowledge base on what we know about risky and impulsive behavior. Additionally, I run a mental health clinic for people who are formerly incarcerated, where we're often using more of the cutting edge research to inform our treatment delivery. And that's another way we ensure that any information we're collecting, any information that's coming from this very vulnerable group, is being fed directly back to these communities or indirectly back to these communities by educating others, so that there's not as much stigma about the experiences that they're having.
Okay, okay. Now I can ask you this, just from your perspective, do you feel like there's currently any realistic type of intervention or rehab, to help prisoners with these disorders or types of behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's so amazing is that there are actually several interventions that can work. And so the question is, or I guess the key is, like, we have to generate the political and societal will to invest in these interventions. So, one thing that we know, broadly speaking, is that many people who are incarcerated come from poorer backgrounds and have had a lack of education. So interventions that are geared at job security, job training, and education while people are incarcerated are very effective for reducing recidivism or the recommission of crimes once people are released. And that's broadly speaking. For people who have more severe mental health problems, substance use problems, or personality disorders, or post-traumatic stress disorder, those are a little harder to treat, but they have effective interventions. It's just that the vast majority of jails and prisons are not treating those disorders, and they're not giving a treatment that is meant for those disorders. So what we have to do is really take what we know from the larger community and treatment and apply them in prisons, and then connect people once they're released from prison to the resources in the community that are using these state-of-the-art interventions. And so, I love this question because everyone's expecting me to be like, no, nothing really works. But like, the reality is we do know what works. It's just we're not investing in what works, quite honestly. That's not to mean there's not more research or there's not more opportunity to improve. Of course there is. But I think as a society, we really need to get to the point of actually just bringing us up to what's considered kind of the gold standard in the community for people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. These individuals deserve the same quality of care that they would get if they were in the community.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think a lot of people take it for granted, on how things like this can affect them. They just looking at it from the outside, like, okay, if this person committed a crime, they're in jail, and that's the end of it. But some of these people are going to get out of jail, so
Yeah.
that can be very helpful for a lot of people coming back into society. Now, I wanted to ask you, like, if you could talk about some of the specific behavior disorders or mental health disorders. Like I had seen you talked a little bit about antisocial behavior. Like, what exactly is that? So, are there symptoms and signs that people can recognize in their family members? Because I'm a African American, so I have family members that have went to prison, and I'm wondering why this person keep going back or keep doing certain things, where other people might look at it like, oh, he's just doing the wrong thing just because.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a really good question. One thing I want to make clear from the start is that we should never equate committing crimes with a mental health problem. There are many, many people who have committed crimes who have no mental health problems. But what you suggested is that there are some people who repeatedly commit crimes that, despite really serious consequences, they keep on doing the thing over and over again that violates some sort of social norm. And it's possible that some of those individuals have various forms of mental health problems that we should be aware of. So one example is antisocial personality disorder. So this is a personality disorder where someone repeatedly violates social norms and laws and engages in impulsive behavior, aggressive behavior, like getting into fights. They show a lack of responsibility, so like not paying their bills or paying their debts back or not holding a job. And so they're kind of just repeatedly over time. So at least for a 2-year period, it doesn't have to be every day, but there are many, many examples where they are just doing these types of characteristics. And what we tend to know about these people is that they tend to be very, very sensitive to emotions. So they're often very sensitive to things like anger, or they're very sensitive to potential rewards. This could be money, or it could even be like the high you feel when you take a drug. Their bodies just seem to be very sensitive to it. And they also have some difficulty on the whole at using forms of cognition that we call executive functions. These are forms of cognition that help us with planning or stopping our behaviors. And so people with antisocial personality disorder are kind of the ones who are repeatedly engaging in behaviors where you're just like, why wouldn't you stop at this point? And we know from decades of research that there are some emotional and thinking patterns that make it more likely that they're repeatedly doing this and make it much harder to stop. But then there's a whole nother class of mental health disorders that we also study called psychopathy, or psychopaths. And this is the term that everyone hears on like every episode of Law and Order at this point, or every, show of Criminal Mind that exists. And so the psychopath is really, really fascinating because these individuals also are impulsive. They also seem aggressive, but in addition, they're very charming and they're very callous. So there are people who might continue to fight or continue to get on someone, even when someone can't fight back or someone, is more vulnerable than them. They're very fascinating because they're people that like you kind of really like and you want to get to know, but then they do these really bad things sometimes. And what's so interesting about these individuals is that they don't show the same problems as people with antisocial personality disorder. They actually show lower levels of emotion, so they're not as sensitive to their own emotions or the emotions of others. And they don't have problems with executive functioning. They have these very specific attention problems. And without going into too much detail, I mention it just to explain that even when we see people repeatedly engaging in criminal behavior or getting into trouble, there could be lots of reasons from a clinical perspective. So there could be multiple diagnoses that they could be dealing with. And then the underlying causes for those disorders are really different. And that's super important then when we think about intervention, because then you can't have a one size fits all treatment. It's a very different type of intervention for antisocial personality disorder than for psychopathy. And both of these are disorders that we do commonly see a lot of stigma against. So as soon as you say, the diagnosis of psychopathy, people tend to just assume that they're evil, that they were born bad, that they're not changeable. And we actually know that none of those things are true.
Okay. I appreciate you breaking that down. I mean, you sharing a lot of information. I'm sure the viewers is gonna appreciate that as well. Now, are you working on any current projects right now?
Yeah, so we have a couple of different cool projects going on. One series of studies that I love that a graduate student and I are working on is trying to understand not only these kind of basic psychological functions and how they relate to, for example, being exposed to violence in their community, but really testing then how certain policies might mitigate against the impact of violence exposure on psychological functioning. So for example, Jordan Ricard, who's a grad student in my lab, has a study that she looked at how people have been exposed to violence tend to show more arousal. They tend to be more reactive to negative information, and that makes it more likely that they use substances to often manage that heightened level of arousal. But what's really interesting is that if they had more access to community services and social services, that relationship wasn't as strong, meaning that just because they were exposed to violence, they didn't show as much arousal, and then they didn't show as much substance use problems. And what this seems to suggest is if you make some policy changes, you can often not only impact the broader community, but it's actually impacting the individual's psychological functioning. And that might allow for kind of broader interventions, and that would save more resources for the kind of harder to reach or harder to treat individuals on a more individual basis. So that's a really cool line of work that we're doing, is kind of combining the individual assessments and psychological functioning with these policy and structural level variables to see how the individual and policy can intersect.
Oh, okay, that's definitely interesting. Now, have you written any books or thought about doing any documentaries on the work and the research that you have done?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I get asked a lot about writing a book, and I have not done that. Yeah, it takes a lot of time to do. But I often am interviewed for podcasts like yourself, and then I do teach a class at Yale, which is one of the largest classes ever offered, called The Criminal Mind. And I like this because you're basically taking a bunch of young people who already think they know of what causes crime and who have watched all the shows, that are popular media, and you're educating them early on about the myths and misconceptions that are often portrayed. And so even though that's not like the mass public, you're taking this kind of very interested audience and hopefully allowing them to kind of extend their knowledge to other individuals. But maybe when I'm, a little less busy, I'll go to writing a book. There's certainly lots of stories that I have heard over my time.
Oh, okay. Wow, that's definitely interesting. So yeah, I mean, you pretty much answered, the main questions that I had. So I just want to thank you again for coming on the platform. I really appreciate you taking out your time to stop what you're doing because I know you're busy, but the information is very helpful. And like I say, it opened up, a lot of people's eyes because we all have, different things going on. And sometimes we have family members, we worry about them, and we would like to know more about what's going on with them. So I thank you again.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure chatting with you, and I really appreciate the work you're doing as well.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Until next time.
Bye bye.
Peace.